Everybody, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. A special welcome to those of you who are participating by phone only, because I know that can be an enhanced challenge in a virtual setting. Being such a participant last week in a meeting, one of the things that I learned is that if you hit the pound key, you can raise your hand for a question. And so we'll just keep our eyes peeled during discussion because we want you to feel as included in the meeting as everybody else. But also feel free to just come off mute and say, hey, I have a question. And we will manage accordingly. And we'll also try to give you a good readout from the chat if questions enter into the chat. So we're really excited for this meeting today, which is Perspectives on Planning about Arctic Ocean Observing. And we envision, so I'm one of the co-chairs of the observing team on IARPC. The other co-chairs are Will Ambrose and Sally McFarlane. We also have the co-chairs of the new self-forming team, the Physical Oceanography Self-Forming Team, which was IARPC has the capacity for people to self-organize and come together and create a space for themselves. And they have done so, and as their name implies, they're very focused on the physical aspects of the ocean. And those co-chairs are Wilbert, Zhujing, and Dimitri. I don't think I missed anybody, right? You're three co-chairs at this point? Okay, I see nodding heads. Okay, and so what we have sat down together and devised is a series of meetings, which from certainly the observing team, we've found has been a little more effective because it allows people to do a deeper dive into a conversation, develop some continuity, a small community of practice of people who want to kind of think about a problem together. We envision that this is going to be the first in a series of 3 or 4 meetings, and which is why we're starting really at the 10,000 foot level and trying to create space for lots of different perspectives about how you go about planning observing systems in general, specific considerations for the Arctic, etc. So you've probably seen from our agenda that we gave extra time for this meeting today to make sure that we can put as many things on the table as possible. And then we'll probably take turns with our post-physical oceanography sub-team colleagues in sharing these meetings and trying to pull together a community in preparation for specifically some of the things you're going to hear about today, like the UN Decade on Ocean Science. But even more specific things that we as a community deem to be important. And so you'll see that we've got a couple different discussion intervals. The longer discussion interval is at the end of the agenda and is, as I said, a little bit more specific to the UN Decade, which I hope you get an opportunity to learn about today. I should also mention we've invited the Marine Ecosystems Collaboration Team to join us today. This is really a pretty broad-reaching topic, and I think IARPC's in a great position to draw together a collaborative focus on how we might do a better job with integrating our planning efforts and make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. Okay, so I think those are the kind of like headline issues. And without taking up more time than that, I'd like to turn over the podium, the microphone, the virtual microphone at this time for the Arctic Ocean Observing Perspectives from Indigenous Communities and seeing things through the lens more of Arctic societal benefit from a planning perspective. And for that, we are joined by Austin Amitsuk and Addie Amitsuk, and they are gonna take it over from here. So please, and if you could give yourselves a fuller introduction at the beginning of your remarks, I would be grateful. Thank you.
Do you want to go first, Dad, or should I introduce myself?
You can go first.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Uvlalotak. Uwanga atira plasiak silasok miurunga agalan ilatka asachaka yagalu kinget miurut atataka or sorry angayuraka tasona lu downstock lu Atataka, Ingeluklu, Janet Lu, Suli, Angitagalu, Donald Lu, Savaktunga, Koerakni, Community Development Specialist. What I just said was good morning. I try to introduce myself in my Inupiaq language just because I'm a second language learner and I want to practice as much as I can. My name is Adelaide Namasuk, but everybody calls me Addie. My Inupiaq name is Aklasia, and I come from Nome, Alaska, but my roots, my mom's side comes from Mountain Village on the Yukon, and my dad comes from Wales, and his grandparents, or his parents come from Nome, but they come from Wales, Alaska. And my grandparents are Harold Amasuk and Janet Amasuk, and Marie Beans and Donald Looper. And I work at Koerik as the Community Development Specialist. I graduated from Linfield College in 2018 with a bachelor's in biology and a focus on pre-med. And before this, I worked in Anchorage as a research assistant for climate forest relocation. So I've done a lot in my short experience. I've tried to do a lot, not just science focused, but Indigenous wellness, and focusing a lot on how to re-envision our future and redefine the economy, especially, and a just transition from this extractive economy to a regenerative one is where I put a lot of my focus. And I am Austin's daughter. I'm his first daughter. So Dad, you can introduce yourself.
Hey, good morning. My name is Austin Amasuk. I was born and raised here in Nome. I've been a tribal subsistence or environmental advocate in my community and in this region since approximately 1997. My background is in environmental science. I've done most of my work in the tribal realm. I've done a little bit in the land management field with my native corporation, done a little bit of environmental work with my tribe. But I've for the most of my career since 1997, been some sort of tribal subsistence or environmental advocate. I'm a lifelong mariner, lifelong hunter, lifelong trapper, fisher, and presently living in Nome, and glad to be here. So thank you. And I think Addie's going to be talking about some perspectives on Indigenous knowledge first before I go. So there.
Cool. And I forgot to do a virtual land acknowledgement. I live and work on the ceded and unceded territories of the Sinisquamiut, the Sinisak people. As do all of us, we all occupy Indigenous lands if we live on Turtle Island or we're here in North America. It's just important to acknowledge that and kind of mend that relationship with the tribal peoples and tribal nations that you live around today. So yeah, I have quite a bit to say, and I'm on my separate monitor right here, so I'm sorry if it looks like I'm looking somewhere else, but I am. But I wanted to just give a little bit of my experience and who I am and how I got to where I am today. So I work as the Community Development Specialist for Koerik, and I help our region doing community planning and identifying priorities for long-term goals and then short-term 5-year goals. So I do that by traveling to the communities, going and staying there for 3 to 5 days at a time and just getting a feel of what their needs are. And that's what my job is right now. But that wasn't I didn't envision myself coming here. 2 years ago when I graduated, I was pre-med. I had planned to go to medical school and be a doctor, but I quickly realized that with our climate and our economy and our ways of life being threatened, that being away from home wasn't something that was going to bring me wellness or bring me healing, or wasn't something that I felt like I should be doing. So I'll just backtrack a little bit. So throughout college, I worked as a commercial fisherman. I was a crabber, a seiner, and a longliner since I was 14. So I have a lot of experience being on the ocean, just work-wise, but living with my dad. He raised us to be hunters, and we were always out on the land, we're always hunting, we're always gathering since we were little kids. So I have a lot of experience kind of being on the ocean, being on the land, like maintaining that relationship with our ways of life is something that's really integral to who I am today. But when I was going to school, I had these dreams of becoming a doctor, but then once I graduated, I kind of had this huge awakening where I was going into health and wellness and wanting to bring community wellness, especially to our communities. But I quickly found out that science and research, especially through a Western lens, doesn't answer all the questions and the holistic wellness of what I was looking for. So I decided to kind of step back from that and move back to my community to get a feel for how we could do this at a community level. Yeah, I decided that studying in Western institutions and learning these ways wasn't going to cut it. It wasn't going to bring me and my family and our community the wellness that we needed. So before that, I was a strong believer in science and Western research until I realized, particularly in medicine, how much whole health and wellness isn't understood or even acknowledged. In my experience, science can look at the superficial information and is really good at telling us, even down to the DNA, what something is, but what it does really poorly at is thinking like a human being. And I quickly found, or thinking like a human being, and I quickly found out after school that I can't just know and understand one subject. I needed to be intersectional in my learning and my understanding if I was going to do anything meaningful for our community. And you guys can tell me to slow down if I'm talking too fast. No? Okay. So I started asking myself, I was able to answer questions in college and do research, and I was focusing a lot on plant medicine. But I found out that those kinds of questions weren't the ones I needed to be asking. So I was asking myself, not only what makes up life or what is the scientific explanation of life, but things like, why is the Arctic a sink for toxic chemicals, or what are the social forces causing this? And then the community aspect, why are people so lost that we turn to alcohol and so many of us are sick with diabetes? Why don't I feel satisfied or valued as an Inupiaq or Yupik person despite going to school for 17 years? Why hasn't science and research been, why has science and research been around for hundreds of years and billions of dollars of funding going towards them, yet our communities are still sinking and our women are still being murdered at 3 times the national average? And lastly, why haven't there been any meaningful solutions implemented? So these are the questions that, after studying biology, that I needed to know more, and that just getting a degree in science or research wasn't going to answer the questions that were going to make meaningful changes in my life and my children and my grandchildren's life. So through these questions, I was able to kind of get a different understanding. And my couple years after college, I spent all my time only reading Indigenous authors, because I spent 4 years putting kind of white Western knowledge on a pedestal and only studying that, but I really wanted to make space and time for learning from people that have done the work before me. So I spent a lot of time reading Robin Wall Kimmerer, Margaret Kovach, Leanne Vetesame Simpkins. These are all Indigenous scholars that have kind of answered and provoked these questions in my mind. And it's through them that I've learned that as an insider and someone who lives and travels to our rural communities and spends much of my time on the ocean and in our villages, that I have inside knowledge and understanding of what it's like to be there. And because of this, I'm closer to the problem. I'm also closer to the solution. And this is something that going to school and doing research at a Western institution isn't taught or isn't even relayed to people that are wanting to go and be a researcher. We aren't told that people that live here that are closest to the problem know the solutions the best. So that's kind of where I wanted to put a lot of my energy. And that some of these research questions, or the questions that I asked, they can't be measured by science, and sometimes they shouldn't be, because from an Indigenous perspective and background, a lot of times science and research has been really hurtful and harmful to our people, and has meant to answer questions and find solutions, but it's actually been doing things without consent or taking information without validating or even giving value to who we are and our experiences. And oftentimes we're kind of put on the side or invited to a side conversation rather than our voices and our solutions actually being put to the center. So I'm just speaking from my experience. I hope I don't mean to offend anybody, but I'm coming to you really real with my experiences and what I know. And this is a lot of the work of what I'm doing is trying to normalize these conversations. So I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody, but I hope that you take this well and really listen to what I'm sharing. And if our goal is to move from the ocean we have to the ocean that we want, I just wanted to say, like I said before, we cannot leave out Indigenous voices and marginalized communities. We should be centered at the table. Thank you, Sandy. And then we must not only center Indigenous voices, but we have to prioritize reparations, decolonization, and healing. Those are three things that if we want to have any change forward, people that are affected by these need to understand that this is our intention, to have reparations, decolonization, and healing. And then most importantly too is centering queer voices, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, two-spirit, anybody else, centering their voices, because their experiences, they are the frontline people. Their existence alone is their existence. They face several overlapping systems of oppression just for being who they are. So making sure that we're centering their voices as well. I'm kind of rambling on, but we also, we want to be intersectional in our ways of thinking, and that's how I do my work. Is when I'm a community planner, I don't just go there with a science mindset or a health and wellness mindset. I hold a community planning meeting, I open it up in a good way, we have some food, and then we discuss what's on their mind. I like to discuss the history of the community, where they came from, and when I have these community planning meetings, I invite everybody. So we have the tribal council, the corporation board, the city council, all their employees, community members are invited. I make sure to invite a youth commission from the high school, and then elders. There's an elder group. So we have a wide range of people that show up to these meetings, and making sure that everybody's voices feel heard, and that their history and who they are. I like to have a day for that, just so that they can feel valued, and making sure that they know that at least somebody who's coming in to know what their needs are knows who they are. And that's a big part of this work, is relationship building. So that's where I'm coming from. Let me see. Yeah, and then, so I also forgot to mention, I'm a National Indian Health Board Health Policy Fellow. So right now I'm working with 12 other Native youth across Indian country, or Turtle Island, focusing on health policy. And my focus is on food sovereignty and redefining the economy. So that'll kind of lead me into my next topic is, there's this movement I'm gonna call it, it's called Just Transition. And it's how we're going to move out of this extractive economy into a regenerative one, because in my work and my short experiences of like figuring out what our needs are, is that like research is one thing, is one aspect of how we're gonna, and knowing what the problems are is how we're going to find the solutions. But unless we have big systemic changes to these systems, that the system, then will research actually inform policy. So I'm just going to share my screen really quick to show you one little diagram on what I'm talking about. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it looks good.
Okay, so what this is, it's just a model. It's a very kind of big model, but it talks about what I'm talking about. So right now we're living in an extractive economy where we have this extraction. Our way that we extract resources is dig, burn, dump. That's what we do. We dig things up, we burn it, and then we dump it wherever it is. And we're finding that it sinks into the Arctic at more than other places in the world. And then the top, so we have the worldview and the governance and then the work. And those three things are the pillars of our economy. So we have a worldview, the work or the purpose that we do, and then the governance. And right now it's governed by militarism and kind of like an imperialistic worldview. Our culture, our worldview is consumerism, and it's a colonial mindset. And what I'm trying to do in normalizing these conversations is moving us towards a regenerative economy. So how can we as a region, or as a state, or as the entire Arctic Ocean, how can we make sure that we're tapping into resources that are regenerative, that we aren't digging and burning and dumping, and that we're changing our worldview or our culture. And a lot of this worldview that we're talking about, our culture, is centering Indigenous voices and ways that we've been doing things for thousands of years, because this isn't something that we need to make up or do on our own. It's something that Indigenous people have been doing for thousands of years. And then changing our governance style from this imperial way of viewing things to a deep democracy, and localizing and making things community organized is how we're going to get to this regenerative economy, and then that'll bring us to a new purpose. So that's all that I wanted to share, and I can put it down in the chat, the link to that it was part of a Zion. I can put that in there so everybody can take a look at it. But one of the last things I wanted to leave you with, and making sure that we're doing this work and planning the ocean in a good way, is making sure that our relationships are first and foremost. You cannot leave out Indigenous people. You cannot expect to make any change or even come and save the Arctic without having a relationship with the people that live there first. So that's all that I have to say.
Thank you. I guess it's my turn. I'm zooming in here from foggy Nome, and I'm going to start off with a plea, I suppose, or a request, if you want to call it that, for the health of my homeland. It's changing dramatically, and the things that are happening to us in the Arctic are impacting us as a people. Our ancestors' bones are eroding into the ocean. If I look at the research, it seems to suggest that my home, the Northern Bering Sea, Southern Chukchi Sea, is collapsing, or at least portions of it are collapsing. And my lifelong experience as a hunter, fisher, trapper, mariner seems to reinforce that notion that there are parts of the ecosystem that I've depended upon for my entire life that is collapsing. And it's that notion that possibly the ecosystem is collapsing, as well as myself, my own existence, and maybe our culture's existence as well, being destroyed along with that collapse, that I make this plea for the health of the Arctic. And other folks have said this maybe better than I. Me being an advocate for quite some time, I was, when I started out, I had, in this role as an advocate, I had always thought that research informs policy. That's not the case, obviously. Policy is informed by politics. And so when we are talking about research and we're talking about my homeland, the ocean, I am not overly optimistic about what Arctic research or what people mean by Arctic research, or what people mean by sustainable development, or what they mean when they talk about the Arctic, because from my perspective, at least as an Indigenous hunter, mariner, those processes, they're not they're not the epitome of all of the ideas for what's best for the Arctic. I do know what works, what seems to work very well, is that if folks like myself, if we are not seen or perceived as a critical native or a frustrated or angry native, if we're not seen that way, if we're seen as someone who has potential answers to collaborate for a better future, I think that's the best possible scenario for my homeland. My homeland is, of course, as some of you know, it's under severe threat. And those threats are, of course, real in terms of climate change, but they're also are real in terms of the narratives about the Arctic. If you are listening to folks in DC, they're talking about the militaristic threats from Russia and China in the Arctic. We in the Arctic, we want peace. There are folks that are talking about national interest in the Arctic, are talking about increased shipping opportunities, port development, infrastructure development. All of these things, they're different ideas that are not the same as ideas we have for our own future. And that's because typically planning efforts like this, and I don't mean to be critical, but planning efforts like this typically create the most space for non-native researchers and non-native policymakers. And that's exactly what is happening now with Arctic policy. DC think tanks, pick your DC think tank. They seem to be driving what is happening with the Arctic policy and Arctic narratives. Not often, and I have high hopes for this effort. I have high hopes that this effort creates space for Native people, whether they're researchers or otherwise, because it's our homeland that we're talking about. It's foods that we get from our land, from our waters. And I obviously have maybe perhaps a different idea of what success is. I certainly want the health of the Arctic to be first and foremost, because that is tied directly to the ecosystem that I participate in, the ecosystem that I'm right next to, the one that we're talking about, the Bering Sea, the Bering Strait. So with all that, I have a fair amount of frustration with what is taking place in our country in terms of dialogue about the Arctic and research about the Arctic. And I certainly hope that it's nothing new for you to understand this frustration about Arctic policy. It's something that a lot of Native people have built deep inside, that inner sense of frustration that a lot of us have with policy. It goes back quite a ways for at least in our region, Northern Bering Sea region. I start counting back to at least the year 1850, when our people suffered some of the first epidemics, and going on into the gold rush era with unnamed, undeclared, uncategorized disease epidemics. 1914 measles epidemic, 1918 Spanish flu, 1925 diphtheria epidemic, onwards to the statehood, state of Alaska becoming the state, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and a whole slew of things since then, particularly modern day experiences that are really impacting our communities negatively, some of which that Addie talked about. So this feeling that we have is a strong feeling of frustration when it comes to policies and such that impact our way of life. I think that someone like myself, when I'm speaking in this vein, I have to have a lot of faith. I have to exercise a tremendous amount of faith that this process that we're talking about, this planning effort that we're talking about, is going to work. I have to have maybe more faith than some of the people who are organizing this, because at least from my perspective as an advocate here, I've come to the realization that even though I've been an advocate since 1997, my own children today are having to deal with the same things that I've been dealing with as an advocate in this region. And those things, that kind of realization, it really hurts. It's a gut-wrenching sort of feeling that we have as Native people, that we are not so much included, that Space Force is not made effectively for these kinds of discussions to talk about our future. There is, of course, a better way to deal with all this, and that is, as hopefully you've heard, you will hear, and as we keep making these same sorts of points, there absolutely is a positive way to move forward, and that's including us in some way, some shape or fashion in our own future. We absolutely, and at times, reach out for help. We absolutely, at times, welcome participation and collaboration. As a person who said it better than myself, the essayist, civil rights leader, James Baldwin said, we don't want anything from you. We want to be left alone so that we can figure it out for ourselves. And that's exactly how we feel with climate change, ocean change, impacts to our ecosystem that we are seeing firsthand. We want some sort of way to figure it out for ourselves, because we're talking about significant things that impact food security, our way of life, foods that we consume every day. So I thank you for allowing me to speak. I hope you've gained some insights. If you want to know a little bit more about what I do, you can Google Marine Program COERC, or you can go to coerc.org. A colleague of mine at COERC, Julie Remian Jacobian, who runs the social science program, you can Google social science COERC. There you can find some of the indigenous knowledge pieces that we've worked on that we would like to see implemented in terms of dealing with Native people, indigenous people, particularly in the Northern Bering Sea. So I wish you well. Thank you, and have a good day.
Hey, thanks to you both. I really value what you just added to our discussion. I used a common term saying we're starting at the 10,000 foot level, but I think what you really demonstrated is our aspiration was really to start at a very human level, in fact, with our feet on the ground, and to start, we see in a lot of contexts that a lot of planning efforts don't succeed. And it takes a leap of faith for everybody, I think, who's giving their time to planning efforts, and for the reasons you just expressed, to a really greater degree, engaging for Indigenous people to engage in planning efforts, but the types of things that you expressed, the importance of starting with relationship building, starting with community building, starting by seeing where everybody's coming from and why they showed up this morning or this afternoon, is really critical if we're going to make progress, because we've seen too many times that we actually haven't made very much progress. And I think we have a lot to learn from how you are conducting yourselves about how to build those relationships. I took some really nice notes from both of your topics, but I wanted to underscore something Addie said, thinking like a human being and being intersectional. When we are engaged in scientific processes, we have to not put aside these other aspects of what's going to make us successful and what's going to help us accomplish what we're trying to do at the end of the day. So thanks to you both for that. And we to stay on schedule, we don't have our just 5 minutes of discussion here, but we can take that 5 minutes and just reallocate the agenda. So maybe let's see if there's some comments or questions that people want to make immediately about this context. And then we're going to turn to some other vantage points and then have a broader discussion. So the floor is open for immediate questions for the next couple minutes.
Just a note, if you do have a question, if you could please say your name first for folks that are on the phone, so it makes it a little easier to follow along.
I've got a question. This is Will Ambrose. I'd be interested in hearing how scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge can sort of inform each other. Clearly, scientific knowledge has not done a good job listening to indigenous viewpoints. But do you see a model where we can come out sort of further ahead than either approach individually? Thanks.
Coeric social science has a very good good literature on that very concept, incorporating indigenous knowledge and using indigenous knowledge. So if you were to go to our, I can in the chat I can put a link into the chat for some of them.
That's great. I can find it. Thanks.
I had pasted the Coeric website too, and then on that you can search the Marine Advocate or Social Science program. But in regard to merging those two together, it hasn't been done before, and it hasn't been done successfully before. So I think it can be done. It's gonna be hard. There's gonna be conflict, and there's gonna be it's not going to be easy. So I think preparing for that, but also making space for Indigenous voices is really hard, because when I'm coming at it from this lens, not only are we having to pave the way for Indigenous knowledge and incorporating it into Western science, but we're having to heal ourselves. We're having to heal our families. We're having to making sure that our communities are well. So we're paving the road while we're driving on it at the same time. So acknowledging that and making space for Indigenous people that are doing the work is really important, because it's really hard to sit here and do this while also trying to provide for our family. It's subsistence time. It's a summer. We should be outside filling our freezer and picking berries, but there's a lot of work that has to be done still. So making space and acknowledging that is really important. But there's a model, I feel like it hasn't been done successfully before. So we need to prepare for that. And it's welcomed, and I encourage, and I want it to happen. It just needs to be guided by Indigenous voices.
Thanks, Addie and Austin. This is Larry Hinsman. I think that was a really nice summary, nice presentation, and good launch, and good input into how this process should be developed. We really appreciate your guidance, not just in this effort, but all through the whole development of the plan, and it's through and then further on as far as engagement in it and active participation in the implementation. This can't be done from just a Western science perspective alone, but we really need the engagement of the Indigenous experts and the local residents and the people who are actually affected. So I just want to, again, say thank you. That was really a wonderful presentation.
is Hazel. I have a question if we have another minute. So I was wondering, I've heard a lot of discussion, I think from folks that are really trying to build this bridge in good faith and earnestly and having difficulty with just the fundamental difference in the way that community decisions are organized and structured. And I think Western planning processes and policy decisions are very rigid and very top down. And there's like a one point person. And my understanding is that there's some difficulty and some disconnect because that's not the Indigenous planning process. And that, so I guess I'm wondering how we can actually shift the Western orientation so that it can work better within that context. And it seems like things get rushed, and then it doesn't have like sort of the space and time to really work together. So I don't know if that's making sense to you, Addie or Austin, or if you'd be able to speak to that a little bit.
Well, the rush aspect of planning in this context or any context or community, if it's Arctic research, ocean type planning, decisions in communities and how we perceive efforts, it takes quite an effort to be able to fully disclose all aspects of that. And that's always been one of COERC's huge problems, is full disclosure and rushing projects. So if one thing could be improved, it's that. In terms of the maybe a dozen or more other things, you're gonna have to cross that bridge when you get there, because you just don't know what's going to happen in terms of planning. We are not all the same in the Arctic. We're not monoliths. Each region's different. So each one of those bridges is going to be crossed.
Yeah, hi, Austin and Addie. This is Molly McCammon. I told some people, I apologize, I'm not on video, but I got stung by a wasp this weekend and the results are ugly. So that's why I'm off camera. But what is your, it seems that building these relationships and having relationships really requires in-person contact and really talking with people face to face. And because of COVID now, we can't really have in-person meetings. And a lot of rural Alaskans can't connect by Zoom. They don't have, there isn't the bandwidth there. So, and I think this may go on for quite a while. This could be what happens for the next year. So what do we do? What do you suggest in the meantime? How do we build these and build these relationships in the next year when we can't have those face-to-face meetings?
Yeah, I acknowledge your question, and I just wanted to add to what Hazel said before too, is that where we're coming from is a place where the system and the way that we do research and policy, in my point of view and my perspective, it's not working. So how we have decision makers in DC, and we're all the way on the opposite side of North America, trying to be guided by the decisions that are made in DC, it's not working. And that's what I really want to outline. And as far as how to make those relationships and build those relationships, I am not sure. We're having to adapt right now in COVID. And especially in me and my position, I'm supposed to travel, but I can't travel. So even my work is being, so I can't do the work that I normally do. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we need to, in order to make the changes that we want to see, we have to make the systemic changes. So localizing community planning normally, and then making sure that our governance system isn't top down, like you mentioned. It's a deep democracy. Community members are the ones that are guiding the decisions and that are putting the solutions and problems forward. Is I think how we're going to have to move forward and transition out of this difficult time, and also envisioning how we're going to move forward is how I see it.
Just real quickly, it's going to take time, Molly. We are really struggling with connectivity. Maybe at some point, 20 years down the road, we'll all be connected like we should. But it is extraordinarily difficult. It's going to take time.
Thanks, Austin. I think as we go forward, if there are other ways of communicating, we would really like to hear from you all.
Thanks for the questions, everyone, and the answers or the responses as well. What I'm going to ask is, we took about 10 minutes out of the end of our agenda, where we normally do community updates. And maybe throughout some of the discussions that are coming up, people could use the chat for community updates, and we'll coalesce those. But I think it was important to spend more time on this. I think time is one of the things that we can do a better job of managing more equitably, having longer formats for these meetings, and having a full series of these meetings. I think are some of the things that we're trying to do from this perspective, and hopefully it pans out. Our next speaker is Craig Lee, and Craig is gonna talk about an effort that has come forward to try to use more of an Arctic societal benefit perspective to drive planning for ocean observing. So Craig, if you want to do a longer introduction for yourself, that would be welcome. And I think either you or Hazel can drive your slides. I'm not sure what you guys decided. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. Let me see if I can get the first slide up here, and then I will go forward. So,
for folks that are on the phone, if you can't see the screen, the slides that Craig is going to be sharing are available on the IARPIC website. And Craig, if you think of it, if you could periodically cue people in as to which slide you're looking at, that would be very helpful.
sure. Thanks, Hazel. Is that showing up okay now? Great. So, thank you, everybody. My name is Craig Lee. I'm at the University of Washington Applied Physics Laboratory. I study ocean physics, so the physics of how the ocean interacts with atmosphere, sea ice at a variety of different scales, and work on the development of different approaches and technologies for making the observations. I very much enjoy working at the interface of that particular discipline and other areas, whether it be marine biology, right? The kind of ocean ecosystems, ocean, sea ice, and atmosphere, different things. And also enjoy working in teams of people to try to affect larger change, right? To try to do very different things. This is a problem that a large number of people have been looking at for quite some time, which is essentially how to craft the kinds of observations that we think we might need, how to even identify what those observations would be, right? How do we decide what are the important things to be observing? How do we sustain these efforts over long periods of time? Sandy has really been a leader in driving a lot of this forward, and certainly changed my mind about the fact that a lot of the ways that we were thinking about this weren't really working. They weren't getting us to where we needed to go, and perhaps it was time to back up and think about the problem a little bit differently. So what I'll talk about today is really it's encapsulated in some of the documents you see in this cover slide, a couple of papers, a larger report that details a few things. They're just the start of this work. They're certainly not the final answer, but just an attempt to get us started along this path. So the vision, and perhaps it's a limited vision and could use some expansion, but really was that we wanted to have the ability to make decadal scale observations. So observations over a very long period of time, longer than the span of a single career, right? So you start to see the problem that a lot of things we do are really personality driven. And they can't be if we want to be able to look at the kinds of problems that we think we face today, right? They need to be bigger than that. The framework needs to be larger. The observations need to be able to inform policy, planning, decision-making at a variety of different levels. And ideally, they would be guided by societal need, right? Not simply scientific curiosity, but actually the needs of society. It's a combination of models and operational forecasts, data products that build upon those observations that really guide that decision making, and it's a variety of timescales that I'll talk about in a moment. And then whatever system evolves from this needs to be integrated, right? It needs to integrate existing observing networks, community-based monitoring, new efforts, right? A very, very wide scope of activity that needs to be integrated into this. So that in itself is a large challenge, right? How do you build a big enough tent that you integrate both at the planning and decision-making level and actually at the implementation, this wide variety of activities. So I surely don't need to talk to this group about the wide variety of impacts that the Arctic has seen from climate change. But I do put up this figure from one of Eddie Carmack's papers. I like it a lot in that it illustrates many different connections between various domains, right? What Eddie has done here is he's listed a number of different domains. He's tried to encapsulate examples of different aspects of climate change and its impacts in those domains. And then he's colored the smaller circles by some concept of what's been impacted, where the orange represents impacts of a warmer Arctic, the kind of teal represents impacts of a fresher Arctic, the grays and the impact of changes in Arctic circulation, Arctic Ocean circulation, and the purple, the impacts of declining sea ice cover. But the other thing I'd like to point out here is that while this has been organized into kind of or system domains, if you will, right? The impacts are actually, most of them societal, right? Where those impacts show up. And what we're trying to argue for now is perhaps taking a step backwards and drawing similar diagrams from a societal benefits perspective, right? So rather than carving it up into their system components, perhaps we take another look at perspective at this, at understanding the activity that we need to prioritize from a societal benefits perspective. There have been over a decade, multiple decades worth of planning for marine sector priorities. Up in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, I've listed some of the priorities that have come out of a science-driven perspective of what might be prioritized in terms of observations, but really from a perspective of thinking about trying to understand the science behind these air system changes. Other documents listed there, and two maps kind of indicating where we're at from an observing perspective during the International Polar Year, over a decade ago, where the observations are distributed more recently. But one could argue that there hasn't been the kind of progress that we would like to see in terms of either identifying and prioritizing what work needs to be supported, or in setting up sustained activity in those priority sectors. So one way of thinking about this is in terms of a range of time and spatial scales and scope that the observations need to be made. If we look at the the left-hand side of this diagram, going upward from situational awareness to climate in terms of the kinds of information and products we might need. On the right-hand side, thinking about it in terms of tactics and support for day-to-day activity, on up to policy and planning, right? How do we make long-term decisions? And those imply observations at scales of decades to the Pan-Arctic. So really, observations are distributed over the entire Arctic because we need to know something about the entire system to inform these decisions. And in decades, because a lot of the processes that drive the long-term changes that we're seeing unfold over a decade. So in order to understand them, we need those observations sustained over very long periods of time. But there's also a need for observations at very short, more focused scales, right? Observations are targeted in local areas where the delivery of that information needs to be real time, needs to be immediate, right? Because the value of that information decreases over time very rapidly. So these are really, they imply a nested set of observations and a very flexible system to deliver that. So what we've been thinking is that maybe another way to look at this, and one that might allow us to make better progress at identifying what the high priority activities might be, that might cast a much wider net in terms of bringing more people to the table to think about what those priorities ought to be. And ultimately, because of those things, perhaps might make it easier to identify ways to move forward, establishing these systems and sustaining these systems over long periods of time, is to start with Arctic-specific societal benefit areas, right? To think about what are the actual things that we're trying to achieve? What things would derive the greatest benefit to our communities, and then stepping backwards towards society as a whole. Right? What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, so there are reasons for communities at lower latitudes to care about these things as well. But what if we started there? The International Arctic Observing Assessment Framework team put together a list of 12 societal benefit areas as a start, and from that defined a number of different sub-areas and key objectives. But you could start with those areas, and if we go to the next slide here, try to map them into these kinds of spatial and temporal scales. Right? What do they imply? Some of them imply a need for very focused information and very near real-time delivery. Others might focus on the longer term, the decadal scale kinds of information that inform planning. Others sit in between. It can be mapped that way. And then if we go to the next slide where it says generalized value tree assessment, they could be mapped in terms of benefit areas to what science questions and operational needs they imply, right? What questions would you have to answer to support the outcomes you'd like in certain benefit areas? What operational needs would you need to fulfill, right? Is it near real-time delivery of data that supports a short-term nowcast forecast model that then provides data products that support real-time decision-making? Is it something larger that provides forecasts on the decadal time scale or on the at least multi-year time scale for coastal erosion? Right? What would you need to support those activities? And then in turn, what observables do those imply? If you conducted this assessment across multiple SBAs, right, you might start to look for science questions and needs that were identified by multiple sectors that map to particular observables or particular activities. And then perhaps once you looked at that, once you looked at the overlap of these multiple analyses, you might be able to identify the highest priority areas to invest in, right? The highest priority areas of activity to try to move forward. And the hope is that in doing this, right at the start, by starting with SBAs, you bring aboard a very large cross section of individuals and expertise. Right, you want to have a large number of experiences at the table when starting to think about this, and when starting to work through this value tree towards the as we go from right to left to derive the get an idea of what the higher priority observables might be. That's the last graphic that I had, and I really wanted to try to reserve a bunch of time for discussion and questions here. So with that, I would open things up for discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Craig. Should we just do Molly? She had a 5-minute piece on the decade, and then maybe we'll go into a general discussion on both the planning methodology and the decade at the end. And so Molly, Molly, did you have slides to share, or were you just
I do have a few slides. Hazel, do you want to bring those up?
Sure, I'll pull those up now.
Okay, and I'll just have Hazel do it. But yeah, thank you all. I have been on a planning group for planning for the Arctic session of the UN Decade of Ocean Sciences. And I think I was largely chosen for that because I was a last-minute substitute for the Pacific planning session, which was held a year ago in Tokyo, and was able to bring an Alaska perspective to that planning session. So next slide. So the UN has declared the next decade from 2021 to 2030 as the decade of ocean science. And the process in the past 2 years has been to hold regional stakeholder input sessions all around the globe. And there have been a number of them already held in the South Pacific, the North Pacific, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and other regions. The one for the Arctic was actually supposed to happen in April in Copenhagen. This is the initiative. The Arctic session is being planned and hosted by the Danish Center for Marine Research with cooperation from the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, the IOC. And so we had a very short time frame to actually set that up. I think it happened between maybe February, January, actually probably February, and then April. And then because of the coronavirus, the in-person meeting was canceled. But there is a task force, a planning task force for this session, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Both myself and Craig Lee have been participating in that, as well as Lee Cooper. We've been working to get more diversity and Indigenous representation on the task force and at the working group levels. Sandy Starkweather was very instrumental in getting in asking the Arctic Observing Summit Indigenous Working Group to nominate some representatives to serve on the task force, or at least that we could put forth to the organizing committee. And so both Austin and Adeline, their names were put forward. I think, and they were received positively by the planning group, by the organizers. I think they're also looking at broad representation from across the Pan-Arctic. So they're looking to Greenland in particular and some other areas. So the overall process in the past has been these large 4-day regional meetings. And because of the virus, this process has changed. And now everything is being held virtually. The timing has also changed as well. So before, all of the regional meetings were anticipated to happen before the actual implementation plan was released by the UN. Because of the delay here, the UN went ahead and released its implementation plan, and it was adopted by the UN General Assembly in June. So you can find that on the UN Decade of the Ocean Science website, that implementation plan. So now we're pretty much going into implementation activities mode. And the Danish Center and IOC have established a 10-month process to develop the action plan for the Arctic Ocean. And I think Addie had mentioned that the goal of this decade is to move from the ocean we have to the ocean we want. Next slide. So because this is now virtual and online, the process being proposed is a series of online workshops to be held in the fall for 6 working groups to develop the draft content for this action plan. And the scope of these workshops now is to identify challenges and solutions for the Arctic region for each of those 6 societal outcomes. And so everybody being encouraged to register and participate in those are to bring ideas, priorities, and knowledge about ongoing and desired actions, partnerships, and include the feasibility and timing of the actions. And we felt it was really important to not start from scratch in the Arctic, because the Arctic Observing Summit has done, and other Arctic planning sessions have done so much already, but to build on existing plans and activities and partnerships. How can we strengthen those? What aspirations could we have? Where do we want to be in 10 years? And so the key dates for this, there's an online registration for the working groups. There's, we're trying to get, identify the working group chairs, and now that it's online working group and not in person, that kind of makes it easier to identify who can participate, because theoretically everyone can participate remotely. The online registration for the working groups closes on September 25th, and then the meetings will be held in late October and November. Next slide. So these are the working group, which are to actually develop the recommendations. Next slide, Hazel. And this will culminate in an online conference, which will be held next spring, not in person, a 2-day period of time for the online conference for the draft plan. And then the presentation of the final action plan would be held in March. So fall sessions, and then kind of a spring finalization of the action plan. Next slide. So these are the societal goals that the UN has, their planning group, and it's a global planning group that was established by the UN. A clean ocean, and that's looking at sources of pollution and removal of pollution. A healthy and resilient ocean, a predictable ocean, so where you have the capacity to understand what's happening now, what might happen in the future. A safe ocean, looking at coastal hazards and ocean hazards. A sustainably harvested ocean, ensuring the provision of food supply. And then a transparent ocean with open access to data, information, and technologies. So these are the organizing structure of the working groups. Both Craig and I have been trying to get the Arctic Planning Group to focus on a couple of maybe key issues, such as the whole issue of food security, food sovereignty, maybe the issue of marine operations, navigation, what that entails. But so far we have not had much success in getting a revision in the planning process. This whole planning session is really being, I would say, structured and dominated by the Danish Marine Center and with the IOC, and they're pretty much following along the lines of all the planning groups that have been held around the globe so far. And I think that was my last slide, Hazel. Is that correct? Yes. So yeah, so I'd be happy to answer any questions about that, but and encourage all of us to participate in this and to help ensure that all of our input and knowledge and expertise goes into this planning session as well.
Great, thank you, Molly. So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to remind the people on the phone that we were going to turn to you first for questions, just because I know it's a little more difficult to participate. So you can either hit the pound key if you want to raise your hand or come off mute. And for the discussion, for those who maybe didn't have the agenda handy, the happy agenda handy, I dropped the questions in the chat. But it's an open discussion, and there's a couple different threads for us to think about. There's kind of just the greater space of how do we initiate a successful planning effort. We heard some really valuable perspectives on that, and in particular, what role might flipping things on its head and thinking about societal benefit instead of science questions driving the planning of the networks and investments play. But then this other thread is we are in the first year of the UN Decade for Ocean Science. We are going to be called upon as the Arctic region over and over and over again to respond to these different kinds of planning efforts, and how might we maybe make it our own and make it very useful for our community, because we are going to get the additional attention of funding agencies and larger global networks during this decade. And is this something that we can maybe steer the ship a little bit more than just responding to calls from on high for information? So I hope I gave the people on the phone enough time to either raise their hand or come off mute. And the first question is to you. Okay, well, opportunity is knocking, but it's okay if you don't have a question. And certainly chime in later if it comes up. The floor is open to any questions or comments at this point.
Hey, this is Renee Tatusco. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Renee.
Hi, Sandy. Molly, I had chatted a message to Don Moore, who's a member of the Alaska, the NOAA Alaska Regional Collaboration Team, wondering if you had briefed that team on the UN Decade of Ocean Science and its implementation plan.
Thanks for the question, Renee. I have mentioned it briefly at one of the collaboration meetings, but not in great detail. So I can talk to Bob and Amy about putting it on the next agenda.
Great, thank you. Because I think the 3 bullets that Sandy had put into the group chat, I think that would be worthwhile to have that team address.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Renee. It looks like Hayo had his hand up next, I think. So let's go to Hayo.
Thanks, Sandy, and thanks to Austin, Addie, Craig, and Molly for the presentations. I'm wondering, in the context of UN Decade, my sense is that the guidance from these types of UN activities is being taken seriously by other countries, in particular Pacific Rim countries or Asian countries, as well as others. And so my question is to Craig and Molly on the one hand, and then to Austin and Addie. So the question of Craig and Molly is, do you see, what do you see as useful input, and do you think that will be acted on in terms of implementing at least something along the lines of what Addie and Austin were arguing for earlier, finding a way to have strong guidance from Arctic indigenous people on the types of observations that are needed in the framework of this UN decade? I mean, do you see this, is there a process, or do you feel that if this working group were to come forward with very specific recommendations, that's going to resonate internationally as well? And if you see a role for, I mean, I'm asking as somebody who's currently leading the International Arctic Research Center, we do have quite a bit of communication exchange with countries like Japan, China, Korea, Canada, and others. And certainly, I mean, I can't speak for Japan as a whole, but my sense is that Japanese researchers are taking very seriously the guidance they receive from indigenous bodies, such as co-management commissions, for example. They're sending their researchers from JAMSTEC, which is sort of a NOAA equivalent, to these meetings, whether they're held in Reykjavik or down in Anchorage in person. So that's one question I have. And then as a follow-up, Addie and Austin, if you have thoughts on what you see as issues of particular concern, looking at research conducted by the broader international community in the Pacific Arctic sector and some of the regions you call home, that would be very helpful in that context as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I can answer that a little bit. Hi, this is Molly McCammon. I participated in OceanObs 19 in Honolulu last fall, and that had a very strong South Pacific Indigenous representation there. I think there was only one Indigenous representative from the Arctic. So so that wasn't part of the UN decade, but it's certainly kind of, I think, indicative of globally the emerging strength of Indigenous voices. So I think where this can be especially helpful in the UN decade is strengthening the Indigenous voice as leaders and as really co-producers of decision-making. I should say the UN decade has no money associated with it. So it's not like there's going to be a pot of money to do things, to do anything. But I think it does act as a strong voice of what is important, what the priorities are, and can influence potentially US research money and US priorities, and affect how the US is looking at the Arctic as well. So I'm not sure if that quite answered your question, but I think it can be influential. But I also tend to be pragmatic and think, does that mean there's going to be more money devoted to the Arctic? Not necessarily. So Craig, I don't know if you had a thought too.
Yeah, Molly, as you know, I share some of what I thought about the UN decade process, and that I think if it can be used to identify opportunities and highlight priorities, maybe identify new ways of going about some of the science, some of the activities that we'd like to pursue, that it has the potential to influence investment. But like Molly, I don't see new investment coming through this, certainly not in talking to people so far. So it really is a way to affect the trajectory of how we're spending our resources now, right? Maybe spend them more effectively. But it's better to have a good plan than to have no plan at all. So if we can come up with good directions to move in, right? Ideas about how extra resources might be invested, it's a tool for arguing for the investment.
Austin or Addie, if you want to speak to the second half of that Hayo's question, then it looks like our next question is from Betsy Baker.
Yeah, sure. If I recall, I think I started off by saying, I wasn't all that optimistic about the outcome of planning efforts such as this or other ones. But the one thing that I have realized with successful efforts is that when efforts to involve communities, that is, sincere efforts would have a similar sort of mindset of a time frame that I'm thinking about, and that is my children's experience in the world, right? So things that help with that long-term, long-view effort that we tend to have, they look different than, they just simply look different than we'll call it the rushed, the periodic, we'll call it interest, or the periodic, sometimes specific sort of scientific interest or issue, whereas we have a very broad view of the Arctic, if you will. So the adaptation needs to be made at least so that there's a frame of reference that you and I or someone else, I and someone else share. So if those can be made, if those connections can be made, I think that's where I see a lot of strength.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think, Molly, you outlined some of the restrictions is that we're just not represented, people from the Arctic at the level that we should be. But I think a big part of that is that the power isn't in our communities and it isn't in our people, it's elsewhere. And it's at these big global meetings that we aren't invited to, or we don't have the time or the resources to get to. So I think that's the biggest restriction. And a lot of our work, or my work when I was at Alaska Institute for Justice as a research assistant, was that we had one small grant for the 15 communities that we worked with that were immediately threatened by climate erosion and were being forced to mitigate, was we had funding for one person per community to have them just monitor any changes that they saw, whether it was taking pictures, whether it was taking, just training them to measure any erosion. We had funding for them to do that themselves. And I think one of the things that we see here is we have people that come from NOAA or from different bigger organizations that are scientists that do the research for us. And the thing is that we can do it ourselves. We just need the resources and the know-how and the power redistributed back to us. So I think that's the biggest restriction. Is like what my dad was saying, is we don't have the same framework that we're working with. We have people at the national or international level that have words for things that people in our communities can't even understand or that we aren't aware of. So is making sure that every community at the global and small level at least has some framework to work together. And I think one easy thing that we can do right now is giving our communities the power to do our own research and monitoring, especially. So I think in planning how we're going to observe is giving the opportunity for community members themselves to do that. I think that's really important.
Thank you. So Betsy, oh, sorry, was someone else?
No problem. Yeah.
Oh,
I just have a brief comment. Okay. Yeah. So first, I will thank Eddie, Austin, Craig, and Molly for your presentation. I think really all your presentation are really well tied together. Basically, how to say that? I think we're moving towards the right direction. Basically, combine the scientific curiosity with the community needs, what Arctic need together, so that we can focus our effort toward the prioritized goal. I think that's great. But I think one thing I'm not clear about is like how, what the implementation will be, just like how you said. I think one way is, yes, we need to think ways to communicate the indigenous need to the science community. For example, the physical oceanography. What kind of questions important for us to address to help you? Then the science community, I think, also should think about to align all these questions to different scientific funding agency missions, then submit their ideas or something like that. Anyway, I think anything our physical oceanography group can help, please keep the community on. Then we will keep working together to think how we can move forward on this direction. Yeah, I think I'll use there. Thank you.
Thanks, Zhijing. And as we said at the beginning, I think it's really going to be valuable that this is a series of discussions that we can return to and build upon and do some relationship building in between meetings. We're not going to have time for all the questions. Some of the questions you're sitting on, if you drop them into the chat, oh, pardon me, my phone started ringing. That will help the collective co-chairs to build on this series of discussions. And for those who can stay on the line, maybe we could just hear from Betsy quickly before folks need to move on. And if you don't get a chance to ask your question, please convey it to us either in the comment field on the meeting and the ARPIC page or in the chat here, and we'll build it into our future meetings. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Betsy. Sandy, you're muted also.
Sorry, you're gonna have to use the chat, Betsy. Okay, well, maybe while Betsy, I see Catherine Burchak has a question as well, and maybe we can just hear from Catherine while we're waiting to hear what Betsy's question is.
Hi, thanks. I was just typing it in. My question is what Austin Amasak brought up, that research doesn't inform policy, that politics do. How do we address that huge elephant in the room, and how do we get the people from the lower 48 and, you know, all through the lower 48 to support whatever the research ends up coming up with for this?
When you figure that out, I'll vote you for president. Boy, that's a good one. I mean, that's like the ultimate question. I don't know. I've had, I think, thought-provoking, long, thorough discussions with politicians, and I thought that I, made a difference, or at least informed their decision. But that doesn't happen. So we certainly all need to work on that. And I try as I might. I've been trying for quite a while. It's a long road to any kind of success. Generally, I just say, to people, I create hundreds of ideas in hope that half of one of my ideas will be ever implemented. So that's the success rate that I've experienced.
And I just have one thing to add. I think in regard to making sure that our research is guided by policy is voting people in that actually, that aren't funded by big money, that aren't funded by the oil corporations, the ones that are causing these changes that we're seeing, that are ignorant or that are refusing to believe what we're saying, is really important. And one of the things that Maine did is they made each state here in the US, they can change the way that they vote. So it's a ranked choice voting rather than you choose one and a winner takes all. So when you change the way that you vote, you change the way that you run for politics, or you change the way that politicians run against each other. So really trying to understand what the political games and the motives are, and then taking it up to the people to increase voting rates. Because we need to be voting people in that understand and actually don't have agendas of continuing to marginalize or just push things that aren't actually what people are wanting. So I think one of the things is following what Maine did and making the ranked choice voting, I think, is one small thing that we can do to change the way that politics is dominating our entire country.
Thank you. And Betsy has her question in the chat now. I'll read it out loud for those on the phone. Is there a way to take Addie's important distinction between extractive and regenerative economies as one message/basis for the Arctic Working Group contribution to the UN decade? Scenario planning might be one way to explore what happens when following one route or the other, and would also allow local observations/research to address impacts created by following the extractive versus regenerative model. And maybe we'll make that our last question for today, but Addie, that was a question to you, I think.
Yeah, I'm just looking through it one more time. Yeah, so one of the things, this isn't the thing that I brought up, it's not one thing that I made up or coined together, it's a movement that was started in the lower 48, the Just Transition, and just earlier this year in January, we had our own statewide summit, kind of collaborating with other grassroots leaders down in the lower 48 and how to implement a just transition and move towards this regenerative economy. And right now here in Alaska, it's at a very kind of like broad, just like there's no specific action really being like taken, but it's a very broad kind of envisioning. And we understand that it will take decades for us to accomplish what we're moving toward as it should. It shouldn't take just a few years. It's going to take lots of time. But I think your question was relaying this to the UN decade. Yeah, I think it's so there's the policy. With the way that I see this is there's like the policy informing work, and then there's the societal community movement changing work, making sure that we as a community are aware that we have this power, and that our rights, they aren't given, they are inherent and they're practiced. So these are things that I think that as a society, we, especially the new generation, that we're waking up and we're realizing and having conversations that this economy that we're living now isn't something that we have to take. We can make it whatever we want and whatever we need, and not so much making policy or legislation to change that, but taking action and living our ways of life informed by this, if that makes sense. So in my mind, and the way that I'm doing it now is I'm trying to practice this way of life rather than doing policy work, because it's hard to, you have to practice it first before you can achieve this regenerative model, if that makes sense. But I shared below or before the link to the Just Transition website, and I think just getting familiar with it and then reading about it. If you have any questions, you can go to the Just Transition website. I'm also a stakeholder for them, so you can reach out to me too. But I wanted to thank everybody for their time, and I'm really grateful for this platform to collaborate and communicate with everybody. This is my first time kind of hearing about IRPIC, and being able to sign up and be a part of the collaboration team. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks so much. I think I can speak on behalf of the co-chairs and the greater group here to reflect back that gratitude to you. I think your objective to set out to normalize some different types of conversations in this context was a really well received, and you know, I acknowledge too, it's not easy to step into a new space and to try to do something like that. So thank you for your contributions. Austin, also Craig, Molly, thank you for your leadership contributions. The work to come on the decade, we'll see where we can get with it, or we do our own thing, and that looks a bit different. But we'll look forward to convening as co-chairs and seeing where we can take this discussion in the future. I think by the number of participants on the call, it's clearly something that people are interested in participating in, and it would be great to even expand the Indigenous voices on the next discussion as well. So if you have some thoughts about how we can do that, it would be very well received. Okay, thanks everyone, and have a great summer month, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.